The manila envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under my front door while I was upstairs getting dressed for my volunteer shift at the literacy center. I almost stepped on it coming down the stairs, my reading glasses perched on my nose, already thinking about the adult students I'd be helping that day. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the logo of Patterson Mills and Associates embossed in gold lettering across the corner. Inside, divorce papers with my name typed across the top in cold, legal font. Eleanor Margaret Hartwell versus Robert James Hartwell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sank into my kitchen chair, the same one where I'd eaten breakfast with Robert every morning for the past 40 years. The papers felt heavy in my hands, heavier than they should have been. Irreconcilable differences, the document stated, as if 4 decades of marriage could be reduced to such clinical language, as if the woman who had raised his children, managed his household, and stood by him through 3 heart attacks and 2 business failures could be dismissed with a legal phrase. My hands shook as I turned the pages. There it was, in black and white. Robert was seeking full ownership of our home, the vacation cabin in Lake Tahoe, his business assets, even the antique furniture I'd inherited from my grandmother. According to his filing, I had contributed nothing of monetary value to our marriage and therefore deserved no compensation beyond minimal spousal support for 2 years. I set the papers down and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden Robert and I had planted together, our second spring in this house. The roses were in full bloom, the ones I'd tended every season while he traveled for work. The vegetable patch where I'd grown tomatoes and herbs, preserving them every fall to stock our pantry through winter. 40 years of my life reduced to nothing in a legal document. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Robert's voice came through the speaker, businesslike and detached, as if he were discussing a client's portfolio rather than the end of our marriage. "Eleanor, you received the papers." I did. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Robert, what is this?" "What it looks like. I'm filing for divorce. My attorney says it should be straightforward since we kept our finances separate from the beginning." Separate finances? As if the woman who had given up her teaching career to raise his children and support his business ventures had somehow maintained separate finances. As if the countless unpaid hours I'd spent managing his office, entertaining his clients, and maintaining the home that anchored his success counted for nothing. "Robert, we've been married for 40 years. We have grandchildren together. Surely we can work through whatever problems we're having." "There's nothing to work through, Eleanor. I've made my decision. Patricia and I are getting married as soon as the divorce is final." Patricia. The name hit me like ice water. Patricia Summers, his young marketing director. 28 years old, with her MBA and her designer suits, and her complete lack of history with the man I'd loved since I was 22 years old. "How long?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "How long what?" "How long have you been having an affair with Patricia?" Silence on the other end. Then, "That's irrelevant. The point is, I'm moving forward with my life, and I suggest you do the same." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 40 years settling around me. "Robert, I gave up my career for you. I raised your children. I supported your business through every struggle and setback. I've been by your side through everything. And I'm grateful for that. That's why I'm offering spousal support. 2 years should be enough time for you to figure out your next steps." 2 years of spousal support after 40 years of marriage? I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. "What about the house?" "The house is in my name. It always has been. Just like the cabin and the business. Eleanor, you're a smart woman. You'll figure something out." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the divorce papers. Everything I'd built,
Everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd contributed to our shared life, dismissed as if it had never mattered. Robert was right about one thing, though. I was a smart woman, smart enough to remember something he apparently forgotten. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, to the fireproof safe hidden behind the false back of my closet. Inside, beneath my grandmother's jewelry and our insurance policies, was a folder I hadn't touched in 40 years. My fingers traced the edge of the document inside, remembering the day we'd signed it. June 15th, 1984. 2 weeks before our wedding. Robert was starting his investment firm then, just him and a borrowed desk in a shared office space. I was teaching 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, making more money than he was. His lawyer had suggested a prenuptial agreement, something to protect both of our interests should the marriage not work out. "It's just a formality," Robert had said, holding my hand across the lawyer's conference table. "We're going to be together forever, Ellie. This is just to make sure we're both protected." I signed it without much thought. At 22, divorce seemed impossible, and I trusted the man I was about to marry. The prenup was simple, straightforward. In the event of divorce, each party would retain what they brought into the marriage, plus 50% of all assets accumulated during the marriage. All assets, regardless of whose name they were in. I pulled out the document and read it carefully, my hands steadier now. Robert had been so focused on protecting his fledgling business that he insisted on the 50-50 split of accumulated wealth. Back then, he owned nothing but potential. I owned nothing but a teacher's salary and my grandmother's antique furniture. But over 4 decades, that business had grown into a multi-million-dollar investment firm. The house, the cabin, the cars, even his precious art collection, all of it accumulated during our marriage.
All of it subject to 50-50 division according to our prenuptial agreement. I smiled for the first time since finding the divorce papers. Robert was right about one thing. I was a smart woman, and I was about to remind him just how smart. The next morning, I drove to the offices of Rebecca Chen, the attorney I'd found through a colleague at the Literacy Center. Rebecca was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a reputation for representing women in high-asset divorce cases. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, reviewing my prenuptial agreement, "this is quite favorable to you. Your husband's attorney should have caught this when he filed." "What do you mean?" Rebecca pointed to a clause in the middle of the document. "This agreement states that all assets accumulated during the marriage are subject to 50-50 division regardless of whose name they're on. That includes his business, which I understand has grown significantly since 1984. I nodded. From a one-man operation to a firm managing over $50 million in client assets. "And the house?" "Purchased 6 months after our wedding with money from both our incomes and a loan co-signed by both of us." Rebecca smiled. "Mrs. Hartwell, according to this prenup, you're entitled to half of everything your husband has accumulated during your 40-year marriage. His filing suggests he either forgot about this agreement entirely or his attorney didn't bother to review it carefully." "What happens now?" "Now we file a response that's going to give your husband and his legal team a very unpleasant surprise." That afternoon, I called my daughter Sarah. She was 35, a pediatric nurse in Portland, and had always been the more diplomatic of Robert's children. My stepchildren, technically, though I had raised them from the ages of 8 and 10 after their mother died in a car accident our 2nd year of marriage. "Mom, I heard about the divorce papers," Sarah said, without preamble. "Dad called this morning. What did he tell you?" "That you two were separating amicably and working out the financial details quietly?" I almost laughed. "Amicably. Is that what he called it?" "Mom, what's really going on? David is furious. He says Dad's lost his mind over some young woman at work." David was my stepson, 37 and a partner in his father's firm. He'd been working alongside Robert for the past 5 years, helping to build the business that his father now claimed I had no stake in. "Sarah, your father is divorcing me to marry his marketing director. He's trying to claim I contributed nothing to our marriage and deserve only 2 years of minimal support." Silence on the other end. Then,
He said what? I told her about the divorce filing, about Patricia, about Robert's dismissal of 40 years as if they'd meant nothing. Sarah listened without interrupting, her breathing growing heavier as I spoke. Mom, that's insane. You raised us. You managed Dad's office for years before he could afford proper staff. You entertained his clients, maintained the house, supported him through everything. How can he say you contributed nothing? Apparently, none of that has monetary value. This is about that woman, isn't it? Patricia from marketing. David mentioned her a few months ago, said Dad was acting strange around her, giving her promotions she hadn't earned. I closed my eyes. My children had noticed what I'd refused to see. Yes, it's about Patricia. Mom, you need a lawyer, a good one. Don't let him steamroll you just because he's feeling guilty about his midlife crisis. I already have a lawyer, sweetheart, and I have something your father seems to have forgotten about. What's that? Our prenuptial agreement. That evening, Robert came home to collect some of his belongings. I found him in his study, packing books into boxes as if this were any normal move rather than the dismantling of a 40-year marriage. Eleanor, he said without looking up, I hope we can keep this civilized. Civilized? I leaned against the doorframe, watching him pack away the leather-bound volumes I'd given him for Christmas over the years. Is that what you call abandoning your wife of 4 decades for a woman young enough to be your daughter? Patricia's age is irrelevant. What matters is that we're compatible in ways you and I haven't been for years. Compatible. The word tasted bitter. Robert, do you remember our prenuptial agreement? He paused, a book halfway into the box. What about it? Do you remember what it says about asset division? Eleanor, I don't have time for games. My lawyer explained everything. Since the house and business are in my name and you never contributed financially to either, the division is straightforward. I walked to his desk and placed a copy of our prenuptial on top of his law books. You might want to read page 3, section 4. Robert picked up the document, frowning as he read. I watched his face change as he reached the relevant clause, watched the color drain from his cheeks as understanding dawned. This can't be right, he said quietly. 50-50 split of all assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name they're on. You insisted on that clause, remember? You were so worried about protecting your business that you wanted everything crystal clear.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Robert sank into his desk chair, the prenup still in his hands. Eleanor, this was written 40 years ago. Circumstances have changed. Circumstances have changed, but contracts haven't. According to our prenuptial agreement, I'm entitled to half of everything we've built together. Half the house, half the cabin, half your business. The business is worth millions. I know. I helped build it. Robert looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the young man I'd married. Uncertain, almost vulnerable. Then his jaw hardened. We'll see what my lawyer says about this. Your lawyer should have reviewed the prenup before filing papers that claimed I deserve nothing, but please, do consult with him. I'm sure he'll explain exactly what 50-50 means. After Robert left that night, I called David. My stepson answered on the first ring, his voice tight with stress. Eleanor, thank God. I've been trying to reach Dad all day, but he's not taking my calls. He's probably busy with his attorney, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from his oversight. What oversight? I explained about the prenuptial agreement, about Robert's apparent assumption that his ownership of the business and property meant I had no claim to them. David listened, and I could practically hear him calculating figures in his head. Jesus, Eleanor, he really didn't remember the prenup? Apparently not. Or he assumed I wouldn't remember it either. David was quiet for a long moment. Then, look, I need you to know that I had nothing to do with this divorce. I've been trying to talk sense into him for months, ever since he started acting like a lovesick teenager around Patricia. I know, sweetheart, this isn't about you kids. But it affects us. If you take half the business, that impacts my partnership agreement, my income, everything I've worked toward. I'd been wondering when this conversation would come.
David had invested years in building the firm alongside his father, had turned down other opportunities to work in the family business. Now that business was caught in the middle of his father's midlife crisis. David, I don't want to hurt you or Sarah, but I also can't let your father dismiss 4 decades of marriage as if they meant nothing. I understand. God, what a mess. And for what? So he can marry some 28-year-old who sees dollar signs when she looks at him? Is that what you think Patricia's motivation is? David snorted. Patricia Summers drives a BMW she can't afford, lives in a condo that costs more than her salary, and somehow managed to get 3 promotions in 2 years despite having no experience in our industry? What do you think her motivation is? I thought about the young woman I'd met at company parties, always perfectly dressed, always positioned close to Robert, always laughing just a little too loud at his jokes. I'd attributed it to professional ambition. Perhaps I've been naive. David, regardless of Patricia's motives, your father made his choice. Now he gets to live with the consequences. What are you going to do? I'm going to enforce our prenuptial agreement. Every clause, every provision, exactly as written. The following week, Rebecca filed our response to Robert's divorce petition. The document was thorough, detailing not just my entitlement to half of all marital assets, but also my contributions to the business over the years, the unpaid administrative work in the early days when Robert couldn't afford proper staff, the client entertainment I'd handled, the business relationships I'd helped cultivate, the stable home environment that had allowed him to travel and work long hours without worrying about household management. Rebecca had done her homework. She'd quantified 40 years of unpaid labor, calculated the value of services I'd provided, documented every contribution I'd made to Robert's success. The filing painted a very different picture from the one Robert had presented, where I'd contributed nothing of value to our marriage. Robert's attorney called Rebecca that same afternoon. Then Robert called me, his voice tight with controlled anger. Eleanor, this is ridiculous. You're trying to destroy everything I've built. I'm enforcing our legal agreement, Robert, the one you insisted on signing. That agreement was meant to protect both of us if things didn't work out. It wasn't meant to be used as a weapon. Then you shouldn't have wielded it as a weapon first by claiming I deserved nothing. I never said you deserved nothing. I offered spousal support. I was sitting in my garden watching the evening light filter through the roses I'd planted and tended for decades. Robert, you filed papers claiming I contributed nothing of monetary value to our 40-year marriage. You're trying to walk away with everything we built together while leaving me with nothing but 2 years of minimal support? How is that not saying I deserve nothing? The business is in my name. The house is in my name. That's how asset ownership works. Not according to our prenuptial agreement. Assets accumulated during marriage are split 50-50, regardless of whose name they're in. You made sure that clause was ironclad because you wanted to protect yourself if I ever tried to leave you. Now it's protecting me from you trying to leave me with nothing. Silence on the other end. Then, what do you want, Eleanor?
I want what our prenup entitles me to, half of everything we accumulated during our marriage. That could bankrupt the business, David's partnership, the employees. Everything could be at risk. I thought about David, about the young man who'd called me mom for 30 years, who was now caught in the middle of his father's selfish choices. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to throw away our marriage for a woman young enough to be your daughter. Eleanor, please, can't we work something out? Some kind of settlement that doesn't destroy everything? For a moment, I almost wavered. This was the man I'd loved for 40 years, the man I'd built a life with, raised children with, dreamed with. But then I remembered his voice when he'd dismissed our marriage as irrelevant, when he'd reduced my contributions to nothing, when he'd spoken about our divorce as if it were a simple business transaction. Robert, you had 40 years to work something out. You chose to file for divorce instead. Now we follow the legal process. After I hung up, I sat in my garden until the stars came out. The roses smelled sweet in the evening air, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard. Life continuing, as it always did, regardless of the personal dramas playing out behind closed doors. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, Dad called. He sounds panicked. Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just enforcing the prenup he made me sign." Good. It's about time someone reminded him that actions have consequences. The next morning, I drove to the literacy center for my volunteer shift. I'd been teaching adults to read for 15 years, helping people who'd fallen through the cracks of the education system find their footing later in life. It was work that mattered, work that made a difference, even though Robert had always dismissed it as a hobby rather than a contribution. "Mrs. Hartwell," called Maria Santos, one of my students, "I passed my GED practice test yesterday, scored higher than I ever thought possible." I hugged her, feeling genuine joy for the first time in weeks. "Maria, that's wonderful. I knew you could do it. I couldn't have done it without you. You never gave up on me, even when I wanted to quit." As I worked with my students that morning, helping them sound out difficult words and build confidence in their abilities, I thought about contributions that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The lives touched, the differences made, the quiet work of building people up rather than tearing them down. At lunch, I sat in my car and called Rebecca to check in on the case progress. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have an update. Robert's attorney has requested a mediation session. I think they're starting to understand the implications of the prenuptial agreement." "What kind of implications?" "Well, your husband's business has grown significantly since 1984. According to our preliminary assessment, half of his current assets could be worth somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 million. I nearly dropped the phone. I'd known the business was successful, but I hadn't realized how successful. $12 to $15 million, half of everything Robert had built with my support, my sacrifice, my unpaid labor over 4 decades? That's substantial. It is, and your husband's attorney knows it. They're probably scrambling to find a settlement offer that doesn't require liquidating major assets. That evening, David came by the house. I found him sitting on my front porch when I got home from the literacy center, his head in his hands, looking older than his 37 years old. "Eleanor, we need to talk." I sat down beside him on the porch swing Robert had installed for our 20th anniversary. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" "Honestly, I'm angry. At Dad, at this whole situation, at myself for not seeing it coming." David looked at me with Robert's eyes, but his birth mother's gentleness. "But I'm also scared. If this goes to court and you get half the business, we might have to sell everything to pay the settlement. That means all our employees lose their jobs, all our clients get disrupted, and 30 years of building gets wiped out because Dad couldn't keep his pants zipped." The bluntness of it startled me. David had always been diplomatic, careful with his words. This raw honesty meant he was truly desperate. "David, I never wanted to hurt you or the business, but I also can't let your father walk away from 40 years of marriage as if it meant nothing." "I know. And honestly, part of me thinks he deserves whatever he gets. But Eleanor, there are 12 other people working at that firm. Good people with families who depend on those jobs. And there are clients who trust us with their retirement savings, their kids' college fund. If the business fails because of this divorce, a lot of innocent people get hurt." I'd been thinking about this too. The ripple effects of enforcing my legal rights, the collateral damage of Robert's choices. But I also thought about the message it would send if I simply rolled over and accepted his dismissal of our marriage. "What are you suggesting?" David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What if we could find a way to give you what you deserve without destroying everything else? Some kind of structured settlement that acknowledges your contributions but doesn't require liquidating the entire business." "Such as?" "I don't know yet."
But Mom, you're the smartest person I know when it comes to finding creative solutions. You've been solving problems for this family for 30 years. Maybe we can solve this one too. That night, I lay awake thinking about David's words, about the employees who could lose their jobs, the clients who could lose their investments, the young man who'd called me Mom for decades and was now caught in the crossfire of his father's selfishness.
But I also thought about Maria Santos passing her GED practice test after years of being told she wasn't smart enough to learn. About the other women I knew who'd been dismissed, undervalued, told their contributions didn't matter. About the message it would send if I allowed Robert to reduce 40 years of marriage to nothing. By morning, I had an idea. I called Rebecca first thing and asked her to request a formal mediation session. Then I called David and asked him to prepare a complete valuation of the business, including projections for future growth. Finally, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my teaching materials and started planning a lesson. Not for my adult literacy students, but for my husband of 40 years. It was time for Robert to learn what contribution really meant. The mediation office downtown felt sterile and impersonal, all glass and chrome furniture that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the navy suit I'd bought for Sarah's nursing school graduation 3 years ago. Professional, dignified, and far more confident than I actually felt. Rebecca met me in the lobby, her briefcase in one hand and a reassuring smile on her face. "Ready for this, Eleanor?" I nodded, though my stomach was churning. 40 years of marriage about to be dissected by strangers in a conference room. As ready as anyone can be for something like this. Robert was already there when we entered the conference room, sitting beside his attorney, James Patterson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit. Robert looked older than I remembered, more haggard, as if the stress of the past month had aged him years in weeks. He glanced up when I entered, then immediately looked away. Patricia was there too, sitting in a chair against the wall as if she were merely observing rather than being the catalyst for this entire destruction. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than most people made in a week, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. 28 years old and beautiful in that sharp, ambitious way that comes from knowing exactly what you want and how to get it. The mediator, Helen Rodriguez, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd built a reputation for handling high-conflict divorces with both firmness and fairness. After the preliminary introductions and explanations of process, she turned to Robert's attorney. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to present your client's position?" James Patterson cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "Your Honor, my client, Robert Hartwell, is seeking a dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences. Mr. Hartwell has been the sole financial provider throughout the marriage, building a successful investment firm while supporting his wife's various charitable activities. The marital assets are clearly delineated by ownership, with the business, primary residence, and vacation property all held in Mr. Hartwell's name. We believe a fair settlement includes 2 years of spousal support to allow Mrs. Hartwell time to establish independent living arrangements." Helen Rodriguez nodded and turned to Rebecca. "Miss Chen, your client's position." Rebecca opened her own folder, placing the prenuptial agreement prominently on the table. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hartwell's position is simple. She's entitled to enforce the prenuptial agreement that both parties signed in 1984. This agreement clearly states that all assets accumulated during the marriage are subject to 50-50 division regardless of whose name they appear under. Mrs. Hartwell contributed 40 years of unpaid labor, business support, childcare, household management, and emotional support that enabled Robert to build his fortune. She's not asking for charity or sympathy. She's asking for what she's legally entitled to under their prenuptial agreement." James Patterson's face had gone slightly pale. "Your Honor, that prenuptial agreement was signed 40 years ago under vastly different circumstances. The assets in question didn't exist at the time of signing." Helen Rodriguez picked up the prenup and read through it carefully. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I watched Robert's face as the mediator read, saw him realize, perhaps for the first time, exactly how binding that document really was. "Mr. Patterson," Helen Rodriguez said finally, "this prenuptial agreement appears to be quite specific. Section 4, subsection B, states clearly that all assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of ownership documentation, are subject to equal division. Was your client not aware of this clause when he filed for divorce?"
Your Honor, my client's understanding was that assets held in his individual name would remain his individual property. But that's not what the agreement states. Helen Rodriguez looked directly at Robert. Mr. Hartwell, did you review this prenuptial agreement before filing for divorce? Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Not recently, no. It was signed so long ago, I assumed. You assumed incorrectly, Rebecca interjected smoothly. Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell's initial filing claimed that Mrs. Hartwell contributed nothing of monetary value to their marriage and therefore deserved minimal compensation. This demonstrates either willful ignorance of their legal agreement or deliberate misrepresentation of the facts. I watched Patricia lean forward slightly in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly together. This probably wasn't going the way she had expected. I wondered if Robert had told her about the prenup, or if he'd simply assured her that divorcing his wife for 40 years would be a simple matter of paperwork. Helen Rodriguez set down the prenup and looked around the table. Let's discuss the actual assets in question. Mr. Patterson, can you provide your client's valuation of the business? James Patterson exchanged a glance with Robert before opening another folder. The firm manages approximately $52 million in client assets. However, the actual value of the business as a saleable entity is more complex to determine. How complex?
Rebecca asked. Do you have a current business valuation? Another uncomfortable silence. Finally, Robert spoke directly. We had a valuation done last year for insurance purposes. The business was assessed at approximately $14 million. I felt my breath catch. $14 million. Half of that would be $7 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Money that represented decades of sacrifice and support and unpaid contributions to Robert's success. Helen Rodriguez made notes on her legal pad. And the real estate assets? The primary residence is worth approximately $2.8 million, James Patterson said reluctantly. The Lake Tahoe cabin is valued at $1.2 million. Other assets? Investment portfolios, art collection, vehicles, various personal property. Combined value of approximately $3 million. Rebecca was writing numbers on her pad, and I could see her calculating. The total marital assets were worth over $20 million. Half of that would be more than $10 million. The magnitude of what Robert had tried to walk away with was staggering. Mrs. Hartwell, Helen Rodriguez said, turning to me, what are your primary concerns in this settlement? I looked at Robert, at the man I'd shared a bed with for 40 years, who was now trying to leave me with nothing. Then I looked at Patricia, sitting there like a vulture waiting for the feast to begin. Finally, I spoke. Your Honor, I don't want to destroy the business that my stepson David has worked so hard to build alongside his father. I don't want to hurt the employees who depend on their jobs or the clients who trust the firm with their savings. But I also won't allow my husband to walk away from 40 years of marriage claiming I contributed nothing and deserve only token support. Helen Rodriguez nodded. What would you consider a fair resolution? I'd been thinking about this for weeks, ever since my conversation with David on the front porch. I want my full legal entitlement under the prenuptial agreement, 50% of all marital assets. But I'm willing to discuss creative ways to structure that settlement so it doesn't require liquidating the business. Robert leaned forward. Eleanor, what are you thinking? For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I smiled at him, not warmly, but with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found solid ground to stand on. I'm thinking that you should have remembered our prenup before you tried to throw away our marriage, Robert. Helen Rodriguez called for a recess, and Robert's team huddled in whispered conversation while Rebecca and I stepped into the hallway. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Patricia talking animatedly to Robert, her hands gesturing emphatically. She looked less composed than when we'd arrived. Eleanor, you're doing great in there, Rebecca said. They clearly didn't expect you to enforce the prenup, and now they're scrambling to figure out damage control. What do you think they'll offer? Hard to say, but it'll be significantly more than the insulting 2 years of spousal support they started with. The question is whether they'll try to lowball you or acknowledge that you have all the legal leverage here. When we returned to the conference room, James Patterson's expression was grim. Your Honor, my client would like to propose a settlement offer. We're listening, Helen Rodriguez said.
Mr. Hartwell is willing to provide Mrs. Hartwell with the vacation cabin at Lake Tahoe, valued at $1.2 million, plus 5 years of spousal support at $10,000 per month. I felt my jaw tighten. $1.2 million plus 5 years of support totaling $600,000. Less than $2 million total when my legal entitlement was over $10 million. Rebecca didn't even bother to hide her disgust. Your Honor, that represents less than 20% of Mrs. Hartwell's legal entitlement under the prenuptial agreement. It's insulting. Helen Rodriguez looked at Robert. Mr. Hartwell, do you understand that your wife is legally entitled to half of all marital assets under your prenuptial agreement? Yes, but, Your Honor, liquidating that much value could destroy the business. There are employees to consider, clients who depend on us. Then perhaps you should have considered those consequences before you decided to divorce your wife to marry your employee, I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's face flushed red, and Robert looked as if I'd slapped him. But it was the truth, and everyone in that room knew it. Helen Rodriguez maintained her professional composure. Mrs. Hartwell, would you be willing to consider a structured settlement that protects the business while ensuring you receive your legal entitlement? I'm listening. I pulled out the notes I'd made over the week, the plan I'd been developing since my conversation with David on the front porch. Your Honor, I'm willing to consider a settlement that includes the following. First, 50% ownership of the family home to be bought out by Mr. Hartwell at current market value within 2 years. Second, the Lake Tahoe cabin transferred entirely to me. Third, a structured payout over 10 years for my share of the business value with guaranteed minimum payments regardless of business performance. James Patterson was scribbling furiously. What kind of minimum payments are we discussing? Rebecca consulted her notes. Based on the current business valuation of $14 million, Mrs. Hartwell's share would be $7 million. Structured over 10 years with interest, we're looking at approximately $900,000 per year. Robert's face went white. Eleanor, that's impossible. The business doesn't generate that kind of free cash flow. Then you'll need to figure out how to generate it, won't you? I met his eyes across the table.
Robert, you built this business with my support, my sacrifice, and my unpaid labor. You don't get to walk away with everything just because you decided you want a younger wife. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. Eleanor, you're being vindictive. Robert doesn't owe you millions of dollars just because you stayed married to him. The room went dead silent. Everyone stared at Patricia, who had just revealed exactly what she thought of marriage as a business transaction. Helen Rodriguez's eyebrows raised slightly, and even James Patterson looked uncomfortable. I turned to look at Patricia directly for the first time since entering the room. Patricia, dear, marriage isn't a participation trophy, it's a partnership. And partnerships mean shared ownership of what's built together. You didn't build anything, Patricia shot back. You were just along for the ride while Robert did all the actual work. Rebecca leaned forward. Miss Summers, I don't believe you're a party to these proceedings. Helen Rodriguez nodded. Miss Summers, please take your seat. This is a mediation between Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell. But Patricia was beyond professional restraint now, her perfect composure cracking. This is insane. Eleanor, you're trying to steal half of everything Robert worked for just because you're bitter about the divorce? I stood up slowly, feeling 40 years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. Patricia, let me explain something to you about what Robert worked for. When he started his business in 1984, I was making more money than he was as a teacher. I gave up my career to support his dream. I managed his office for the first 5 years because he couldn't afford proper staff. I entertained his clients in our home, cooked dinner for business meetings, maintained the household so he could travel and work 16-hour days. I raised his children from his first marriage while he built his reputation. I supported him through 3 heart attacks and 2 business recessions. I've been his partner for 40 years, and partnership means shared ownership. Patricia's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. That's what wives are supposed to do. That's just being supportive. No, Patricia, that's what business partners do, and business partners share in the profits. I sat back down, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. Robert knew this when he insisted on our prenuptial agreement. He wanted to make sure that everything we built together would be split equally if our marriage ended. He just never imagined he'd be the one ending it. Robert was staring at the table, his face ashen. Finally, he looked up at me. Eleanor, I never meant for it to happen this way. What way, Robert? You never meant to get caught? You never meant for me to enforce our legal agreement? You never meant for your actions to have consequences? I never meant to hurt you. The simple statement hung in the air between us, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago, vulnerable, uncertain, almost lost. But then I remembered the divorce papers, the dismissal of our marriage, the casual cruelty of claiming I'd contributed nothing of monetary value to our 40-year marriage. Robert filed papers claiming I contributed nothing of monetary value to our 40-year marriage. He offered me 2 years of minimal support and expected me to disappear quietly so he could start fresh with his girlfriend? How is that not meant to hurt me? He had no answer for that. Helen Rodriguez called another recess, and this time, Robert's team requested a private consultation room. Rebecca and I waited in the lobby while they presumably tried to figure out how to minimize the damage Robert had done to himself. That outburst from Patricia probably helped your case, Rebecca said quietly. Nothing like having the other woman reveal her true feelings about marriage as a business transaction. She's young, I said, though I felt no sympathy for her. She probably thinks love is enough to build a life on. Do you think Robert loves her? I considered that question, watching the afternoon traffic through the lobby windows, people going about their normal lives, unaware of the drama playing out in conference rooms above them. I think Robert loves the idea of being 30 years younger. I think he loves feeling desired by someone who wasn't there for his failures and struggles. I think he loves the fantasy of starting over without consequences. But not her specifically? Rebecca, Robert truly loved Patricia, he would have asked for a divorce honestly, acknowledged what our marriage meant, and negotiated a fair settlement. Instead, he tried to erase 40 years as if they'd never happened. That's not love. That's selfishness. After an hour, we were called back to the conference room. Patricia was no longer there, and Robert looked like he'd aged another 10 years. James Patterson's expression was grim as he addressed the mediator. Your Honor, my client has reconsidered his position. He acknowledges Mrs. Hartwell's legal entitlement under the prenuptial agreement and is prepared to discuss a more reasonable settlement. Helen Rodriguez nodded. What are you proposing? Mr. Hartwell will transfer full ownership of the Lake Tahoe cabin to Mrs. Hartwell, valued at $1.2 million. He will buy out her 50% share of the family home within 18 months at current market value, approximately $1.4 million. And he will provide a structured business settlement over 8 years totaling $6 million. Rebecca calculated quickly. That's approximately $8.6 million total, which is still short of Mrs. Hartwell's full legal entitlement. James Patterson looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, that's the maximum settlement my client can provide without liquidating the business entirely. I looked at Robert. Really looked at him. The man who'd shared my bed for 40 years, who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, who'd celebrated with me when the kids graduated, who'd been my partner through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life together. Robert, I said quietly, is this really how you want our marriage to end? With lawyers calculating the minimum you can get away with paying me? He met my eyes for the first time since the mediation began. Eleanor, what do you want from me? I want you to acknowledge what our marriage meant. I want you to recognize my contributions. I want you to treat me with the same respect you'd show any business partner you were dissolving a partnership with. And if I do that, I pulled out the settlement proposal I'd written the night before, the one I'd hoped I wouldn't need to use. Then I'm willing to accept a settlement that gives you a path forward without destroying everything we built together. Helen Rodriguez leaned forward. What are you proposing, Mrs. Hartwell? I slid the paper across the table. Full ownership of the Lake Tahoe cabin, 50% of the current home value to be paid within 2 years, and 40% of the business instead of 50%, structured as a limited partnership with guaranteed annual payments over 12 years. Rebecca looked surprised.
Eleanor, that's less than your full legal entitlement. I know, but it's more than Robert's current offer. And it gives him a realistic path to keep the business operational. I looked at Robert. In exchange, I want a public acknowledgement that I was a full partner in building our life together. I want you to tell our children, our friends, our community that this divorce isn't happening because I failed as a wife, but because you chose someone else. The room was quiet except for the sound of James Patterson calculating numbers on his legal pad. Finally, Robert spoke. Eleanor, that settlement would still be almost $8 million over 12 years. Robert, the business has averaged over 10% growth annually for the past decade. If that continues, you'll be able to afford the payments easily. And if it doesn't, you'll need to make some changes to ensure it does. And if I refuse? I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of 40 years of compromise and accommodation finally lifting from my shoulders. Then we go to court, and I demand my full legal entitlement under our prenuptial agreement, 50% of everything, liquidated immediately if necessary. Robert stared at me, and I could see him calculating, not just numbers, but consequences. The business he'd built, the employees who depended on him, the clients who trusted him, the son who'd invested his career in the family firm, all of it at risk because he'd decided his marriage was worth nothing. I need to think about this, he said finally. Helen Rodriguez nodded. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That gives everyone time to review the proposals and consult with their clients. As we packed up our papers and prepared to leave, Robert caught my arm gently. Eleanor, can we talk privately for a minute? I looked at Rebecca, who nodded. I'll wait in the lobby. When we were alone, Robert sat heavily in his chair. Eleanor, I want you to know that none of this was about you not being enough. Then what was it about, Robert? He was quiet for a long time, staring out the conference room windows at the city skyline. I don't know. I guess I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions of living instead of actually living. And Patricia makes you feel visible? She makes me feel like I matter, like I'm interesting and successful and worth paying attention to. He looked at me with eyes that held 40 years of shared history. Eleanor, when was the last time you looked at me like I was someone exciting? The question hit me unexpectedly. When had I stopped seeing Robert as the ambitious young man I'd fallen in love with? When had he become just the person who shared my daily routine, my household responsibilities, my comfortable but predictable life? Robert, when was the last time you looked at me like I was someone exciting? We sat in silence, two people who'd somehow lost each other despite sharing the same house for 4 decades. Finally, Robert spoke. Eleanor, I'm sorry for all of this, for the way I handled it, for the things I said, for trying to diminish what you contributed to our life together. You deserved better. Yes, I did. I stood up and gathered my purse. The question now is whether you're going to do better going forward. That evening, David came by the house with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I discovered Robert's true intentions a month ago, and talked through the day's mediation. So Dad's actually considering a fair settlement? David asked, serving himself lo mein from the carton. He's considering a realistic settlement. I reduced my demands to give him a path forward that doesn't require liquidating the business. David looked up from his food. Why would you do that? You're legally entitled to half of everything. I sipped my wine, thinking about the question. Because, sweetheart, sometimes being right isn't the same as being wise. Yes, I could force my father to liquidate everything and give me exactly what I'm entitled to, but that would destroy the business you've worked so hard to build, put 12 employees out of work, and disrupt the financial security of dozens of client families.
But you'd be financially secure. I'd be wealthy and alone, watching the collateral damage from your father's selfishness destroy other people's lives. I reached across the table and took David's hand. David, you've been my son for 30 years. I won't bankrupt your future just to punish your father for his mistakes. David squeezed my hand. Mom, you know I love you, right? And that none of this changes how I feel about you being part of our family? I know, sweetheart. And you know that Sarah feels the same way? We're both furious at Dad for putting you through this. I smiled, feeling some of the loneliness of the past month ease. I know that too. What happens if Dad accepts your settlement offer? Then he pays me what I'm owed, acknowledges publicly that our marriage was a true partnership, and we all figure out how to move forward as a family that looks different than it used to. And if he doesn't? I thought about Robert, sitting in that conference room, looking older and more uncertain than I'd seen him in years. Then I enforce my legal rights and let the consequences fall where they may. David nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're being more generous than he deserves. Maybe. But I'm not doing this for him, David. I'm doing it for you, for Sarah, for the employees who depend on the business, and for my own peace of mind. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I fought for what I deserved without destroying innocent people in the process. The next morning, I arrived at the mediation office 30 minutes early and sat in my car, gathering my courage for what might be the final negotiation of my marriage. 40 years of shared history about to be reduced to financial terms and legal documents. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that made everything seem possible. Rebecca met me in the lobby, looking confident and prepared. Ready for this, Eleanor? As ready as I'll ever be. Robert was already in the conference room when we arrived, sitting alone with his attorney. Patricia was nowhere to be seen, and Robert looked like he hadn't slept much. James Patterson stood when we entered, his expression more respectful than it had been yesterday. Helen Rodriguez called the session to order and looked expectantly at Robert's table. Mr. Patterson, has your client reached a decision regarding Mrs. Hartwell's settlement proposal? James Patterson opened his folder and pulled out a document. Your Honor, my client accepts Mrs. Hartwell's proposal with one modification. I felt my heart rate increase. What modification? Robert spoke directly to me, his voice quiet but clear. Eleanor, I accept all the financial terms you proposed. The cabin, the house buyout, the business partnership payments over 12 years. But I want to add something to the agreement. What? I want to include a public statement acknowledging your contributions to our marriage and our business. Not just because you're requiring it, but because it's true, and because you deserve it to be said. I stared at him, unsure whether to trust this apparent change of heart. What kind of statement? Robert pulled out a handwritten letter and slid it across the table. I spent all night writing this. I want to read it publicly at our announcement of the divorce settlement, and I want it included as part of our legal agreement. I picked up the letter and read it silently, feeling tears prick my eyes as I took in his words. It was an acknowledgement of everything I sacrificed, everything I contributed, everything I'd given up to support his dreams and our family. It was the recognition I'd been seeking for 40 years. Helen Rodriguez waited patiently while I finished reading. Finally, I looked up at Robert. Are you willing to make this statement publicly? Yes. To our children, to our friends, to our business associates, to anyone who asks why our marriage is ending. I want them to know that it's not because you failed as a wife, but because I failed as a husband. Rebecca leaned over to read the letter, her eyebrows rising as she took in the content. Eleanor, this is quite comprehensive. He's acknowledging not just your domestic contributions, but your direct business contributions as well. I looked at Robert, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Humility, recognition, maybe even respect. Why now, Robert? Why this change? He was quiet for a moment, his hands folded on the table in front of him. Because Patricia left me yesterday after the mediation. She said she didn't sign up to be married to someone with massive debt payments and a complicated family situation. She wanted the successful businessman, not the man who'd made mistakes and had to pay for them. I felt a moment of satisfaction, followed quickly by something unexpected. Sympathy.
Not for the loss of Patricia specifically, but for Robert's realization that he'd thrown away 40 years for someone who'd only loved his image of success. I'm sorry, Robert. No, Eleanor, I'm sorry. You were right yesterday when you asked when I'd last looked at you like you were exciting. I can't remember. But I can remember dozens of times when you looked at me that way even when I didn't deserve it, especially when I didn't deserve it. Helen Rodriguez cleared her throat gently. Are we ready to finalize this settlement agreement? I looked around the table. At Rebecca, who'd fought so hard for my rights, at James Patterson, who'd learned to respect my position, at Helen Rodriguez, who'd guided us through this difficult process, and finally at Robert, the man who'd been my partner for 40 years and was now offering me the recognition I'd always deserved. Yes, I said finally. Let's finalize it.
The paperwork took another 2 hours, but by noon, I was officially divorced and significantly wealthier. More importantly, I had a legal document acknowledging my contributions and Robert's commitment to honor them publicly. As we prepared to leave, Robert approached me one last time. Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask this, but I hope someday we can be friends again. Not husband and wife, but friends. For the kids' sake, and for the sake of 40 years that weren't all bad. I considered his request, thinking about Sarah and David, about future grandchildren, about the reality of remaining connected despite the end of our marriage. Robert, I think friendship will depend on whether you follow through on the commitments you made today, both the financial ones and the personal ones. He nodded. I understand. And Eleanor, thank you for not destroying everything out of anger. You had the right to, and you chose not to. That says something about who you are. As I walked out of that conference room for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly, but a sense of completion. 40 years of marriage were ending, but they were ending with dignity and recognition, rather than dismissal and contempt. I had $8 million coming to me over the next 12 years, a beautiful cabin in Lake Tahoe, and the public acknowledgement that I'd been a true partner in building the life Robert had tried to claim as entirely his own. But more than that, I had my self-respect back. And after 40 years of compromise and accommodation, that felt like the most valuable settlement of all. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting on the deck of my Lake Tahoe cabin, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The cabin that Robert had once considered his personal retreat was now entirely mine, and I'd spent the past month making it truly feel like home. New furniture, fresh paint, and a vegetable garden that reminded me of the one I'd tended for decades in our old backyard. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mom, did you see the article in the Business Journal about Dad's firm? I hadn't, so I pulled up the online edition while sipping my morning coffee. The headline made me smile. Local investment firm demonstrates commitment to gender equity in leadership. The article detailed how Robert had restructured his business to bring in more female partners and had implemented profit-sharing programs for all employees, not just senior staff. The article quoted Robert extensively about his newfound commitment to recognizing all contributions to business success, regardless of gender or role. He spoke eloquently about how support staff, administrative assistants, and family members often provide invisible labor that enables businesses to thrive. It was a complete reversal from the man who had claimed I'd contributed nothing to his success just months earlier. I forwarded the article to Rebecca with a note. Looks like someone learned something from our mediation sessions. Her response came back immediately. Amazing what financial consequences can teach people about fairness. How are you adjusting to your new life? The question made me pause and look around my cabin. In the past 6 months, I'd traveled to places I'd always dreamed of seeing.
I'd taken a photography course, learned to paint watercolors, and started writing a memoir about finding your voice after decades of accommodation. I'd also increased my volunteer work with the Literacy Center, now funding a scholarship program for adult learners pursuing their GEDs. But perhaps most surprisingly, I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed living alone. After 40 years of coordinating schedules, preferences, and needs with someone else, the freedom to make decisions based solely on my own desires felt revolutionary. David called that afternoon while I was working in my garden, his voice excited in a way I hadn't heard since before the divorce proceedings began. "Eleanor, I have news. The firm just landed the Morrison Group account. It's the biggest client we've ever signed." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. How did that happen?" Funny story. Morrison's CEO is a woman named Janet Morrison, who'd heard about Dad's public statement regarding your contributions to the business. She said she was impressed by a man willing to acknowledge his mistakes and give credit where it was due. Apparently, she'd been looking for an investment firm that understood the value of partnership, not just profit. I laughed, imagining Robert's face when he realized his forced acknowledgement of my contributions was actually helping his business rather than hurting it. "How is your father handling all the changes?" David was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I think he's struggling. The business is doing better than ever, but he seems lost personally. He's thrown himself into work completely, stays at the office until 10 or 11 every night. I think he's realizing what he gave up." And Patricia? Gone completely. Moved to San Francisco about 2 months ago to work for some tech startup. I heard through the grapevine that she's engaged to her new boss already. I felt a complicated mix of emotions at that news. Satisfaction that Robert's judgment of character was so poor, but also sadness for the man who'd discovered that love based on success and status disappears the moment those things become complicated. "David, is your father happy?" Another pause. "I don't think he knows how to be happy anymore, Mom. I think he's realized that happiness isn't something you can acquire by changing your circumstances. It's something you build with people who know you and choose to love you anyway." That evening, I got an unexpected call from Robert himself. We hadn't spoken since the day we'd signed the final divorce papers, though our children had kept me updated on his well-being. "Eleanor, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Robert. How are you?" "I'm calling because I owe you another apology, a better one than I gave you during the mediation." I set down my book and walked out onto the cabin's deck where the lake reflected the evening stars. "What kind of apology?" "The kind where I actually understand what I'm apologizing for." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, I've been seeing a therapist since the divorce, trying to understand how I could have convinced myself that throwing away 40 years for someone I barely knew was a reasonable decision. And what have you learned? That I was terrified of getting older, that I thought if I could surround myself with youth and newness, I could somehow stop time. That I was so focused on what I thought I was missing that I couldn't see what I already had. I listened to the sound of water lapping against the dock below my deck, thinking about the young man I'd married and the older man he'd become, and the woman I'd been and who I was now. Robert, we both changed over 40 years. That's what people do. But you changed while still honoring what we'd built together.
I changed by trying to escape from it. His voice caught slightly. "Eleanor, I know there's no going back, and I'm not asking for that. But I want you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not just a wife, but a partner. Not just a marriage, but a friendship. Not just a relationship, but a home." The words hung between us across the phone line, carrying the weight of 4 decades and all the might-have-beens that would never be. "Robert, I appreciate you saying that. It means something to hear you acknowledge what our marriage really was. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy? In your new life, I mean. I looked out at the lake, at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky, at the garden I'd planted with my own hands for my own pleasure. Yes, Robert, I think I am. For the first time in a long time, I'm living my own life instead of supporting someone else's dreams. I'm glad. You deserve that. After we hung up, I sat on my deck for a long time thinking about the conversation and what it meant. There was closure in Robert's words, acknowledgement not just of what he'd done wrong, but of what he'd lost. It didn't change the past or erase the pain, but it provided a kind of peace I hadn't expected to find. 3 months later, Sarah came to visit me at the cabin for a long weekend. She found me in my art studio, a converted bedroom where I'd been working on a series of paintings inspired by the changing seasons on the lake. "Mom, these are beautiful," she said, examining a canvas that captured the lake during a winter storm. "I had no idea you were this talented." Neither did I, honestly. Turns out there are a lot of things about myself I never had time to discover. Sarah settled into the comfortable chair I kept in the studio for visitors. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Always." "Do you ever regret it, fighting for the settlement instead of just taking what Dad offered initially?" I set down my paintbrush and really considered the question. "Sarah, if I'd accepted your father's original offer, I'd have 2 years of minimal support and a lifetime of knowing I'd let someone reduce 40 years of my life to nothing. Instead, I have financial security, public acknowledgement of my contributions, and most importantly, I have my self-respect. But you could have had all that and still been married to Dad. Could I? Your father made it clear that he saw our marriage as a burden he wanted to escape from. Even if he hadn't filed for divorce, we would have been living a lie. At least this way, we both have the chance to build authentic lives." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I think the real difference is?" "What's that?" "You fought for what you deserved, instead of accepting what someone else decided you were worth. That's something I want to remember for my own life." On the 1-year anniversary of receiving those divorce papers, I hosted a dinner party at the cabin. Sarah and David came with their families, along with Rebecca, several friends from the Literacy Center, and Janet Morrison, who had become a close friend after our businesses began collaborating on financial literacy programs for adult learners. As we sat around the table on my deck, watching my grandchildren play in the shallow water near the dock, Janet raised her glass for a toast. To Eleanor, who reminded all of us that knowing your worth isn't arrogant, it's essential. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just contentment, but genuine joy. Not the happiness that comes from avoiding conflict, but the satisfaction that comes from facing it head-on and emerging stronger. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked down to the end of my dock and looked out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the full moon like a mirror. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called out, its haunting song echoing across the water. I thought about the woman who had found those divorce papers a year ago, who had felt her world collapsing around her as she realized her husband wanted to erase 4 decades as if they'd never mattered. That woman was afraid, uncertain, willing to accept scraps rather than demand her due. I thought about the woman I was now, standing on a dock I owned, looking at a lake that belonged to me, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd built according to my own values and desires. This woman wasn't afraid to take up space, to ask for what she deserved, to refuse to be diminished by someone else's limited vision of her worth. The prenuptial agreement that Robert had insisted on to protect himself ultimately protected me instead. But more than that, it had taught me something valuable about the difference between legal rights and personal worth. I'd always had the worth. The legal rights just gave me a way to enforce it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but when I opened it, I recognized the sender. It was from Maria Santos, my former student from the Literacy Center, who had not only earned her GED, but was now enrolled in community college. "Mrs. Hartwell, I saw the article about your scholarship program in the local paper. I wanted you to know that you believing in me changed my life. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to fight for what you deserve." I smiled, thinking about all the ways that standing up for yourself creates ripple effects you never expect. Maria had found her voice through literacy, and I'd found mine through refusing to accept less than I was worth. Both of us had learned that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. As I walked back up to my cabin, I caught sight of my reflection in the sliding glass door. The woman looking back at me was older than the one who had married Robert 41 years ago, but she was also stronger, more confident, more authentically herself. She'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that partnership means shared investment in success, not just shared space in a house. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair with a book. Tomorrow, I had plans to hike a new trail with Janet, work on my memoir, and video call with my grandchildren. A life full of choices I'd made for myself, relationships I'd chosen based on mutual respect, and activities that brought me genuine joy rather than just filling time. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the lake gently lapping against my windows. It was the sound of peace, of contentment, of a life lived on my own terms. And for the first time in decades, that was more than enough.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.